Greetings, my name is Ariel Gordon and I'm the Promotions and Publicity Coordinator for University of Manitoba Press. Thanks so much for joining us for the launch of Pathways of Reconciliation, Indigenous and Settler Approaches to Implementing the TRC's Call to Action. Editors Aimée and Paulette Regan will be joined tonight by contributors Régine King, Cheryl Lightfoot, David B. McDonald, and Andrea Walsh. Now, this event is being sponsored by the University of Manitoba's Institute for the Humanities. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Institute for the Humanities, just because they've been so generous to support this whole series of launches we've done this fall. So, the University of Manitoba Institute for the Humanities was established in 1990 to foster research and scholarship in the humanities at the University of Manitoba, to promote cross-disciplinary research in the humanities, and to help obtain external funding for humanities research. The Institute addresses the needs and interests of researchers in a broad range of subjects, including literature and languages, film and visual culture, philosophy, history, and religion, and also the literary, philosophical, theological, and historical aspects of the social and physical sciences, mathematics, the arts, and professional studies. It also supports an annual graduate fellowship worth up to $5,000. UMIH supports 2 or 3 research clusters and 2 or 3 research affiliates. The Institute is located within the Faculty of Arts, but is intended to serve the entire humanities constituency in the university and the general community. The Institute is accordingly committed to community outreach through programs and lecture series for the general public, and UMIH is involved in various interdisciplinary humanities-themed research activities. So for more information on the UMIH and its programming, you can visit this link, which I'm putting in the chat, or you can follow them on Facebook. The next thing that I would like to do is a land declaration. University of Manitoba Press is located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. U of M Press respects the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. We're so pleased to be launching this book tonight. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to introduce the editors, and then they will take it away. So, Aimée is an Indigenous Anishinaabe Métis lawyer called to the bar in 2005 from Treaty 1 territory in Manitoba. She is currently an associate professor at the Faculty of Common Law, University of Ottawa. Kraft is the former director of research at the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, and the founding director of research at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Her book, Breathing Life into the Stone Fort Treaty, An Anishinaabe Understanding of Treaty 1, 2013, won the Eileen McTavish Sykes Award for Best First Book. Paulette Regan is an independent scholar, researcher, public educator, and co-facilitator of an intercultural and reconciliation education workshop series. Formerly the research director for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, she was the senior researcher and lead writer on the reconciliation volume of the TRC final report. Her book, Unsettling the Settler Within, Indian Residential Schools, Truth-Telling and Reconciliation in Canada, 2010, was shortlisted for the 2012 Canada Prize. Please welcome Aimée and Paulette.
Hi there. It's great to be here. My name is Aimée and I'm joining you from Treaty 3 territory, Anishinaabe. I'm very grateful to everyone who's joining us tonight to not only launch this book, but to really celebrate it and talk a little bit about how it came to be and how it can serve as a guide for some of us who are thinking through the complex questions of reconciliation in Canada. So the book is called Pathways of Reconciliation, and it originates in a conference that was held in 2016 in Winnipeg. And at that time, I was the director of research at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and Paulette was the senior advisor on reconciliation at that same organization. And what we agreed to do with the University of Manitoba Press was to bring together some of the amazing contributions that had been made to this conference, and to solicit some of our colleagues from across Canada and the world that were working on reconciliation, and to bring their thoughts and ideas and practice and stories together into this one volume. So a bit about the book and its purpose is that, you know, often after the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, released its final report and the calls to action, I got the question, and I know a lot of us heard this question so many times: how can I participate in reconciliation? What is my obligation? How do I do this? How do I actually give effect to reconciliation? And undoubtedly, many people also felt that it was a really daunting task to be making societal change like the TRC had called for. So in thinking about how this book would come together, we wanted to have practical examples and ideas and inspiring stories, and also to challenge people to think about what worked well, but also what was difficult in their own process of reconciliation, or what was attempted and might not have worked, but is worth telling as a story, even in not having its full outcome of success, quote unquote, or however we define success. So this book came together, and we thought about, well, what are we going to call it? And the conference itself set out the idea of pathways and different approaches, and we decided to call this edited volume Pathways of Reconciliation, rather than Pathways to or towards Reconciliation. So what we wanted to do through that is recognize that reconciliation isn't only an ultimate goal or a destination, but it's a decolonizing process of journeying in ways that embody everyday acts of resistance, resurgence, solidarity, and then coupling that with renewed commitments to justice, dialogue, relationship building. So this book is really about how to find your way forward through that, and about the journey of reconciliation. So the book itself is structured in a few different themes, thematic sections that are built around reframing reconciliation, learning and healing, researching and living reconciliation. So we're engaging with all of these different approaches throughout the volume, with a variety of different frameworks that are sometimes very explicit in the chapters, sometimes more implicit in their use through practical examples. And what we wanted to do really was illustrate the complexities of the reconciliation processes themselves. So we look at and we canvass multiple pathways, Indigenous, non-Indigenous perspectives, and these approaches that are trying to respond to the TRC calls to action. What I think is especially great about this book is that the authors are not only academics, but also practitioners and students and ordinary citizens, and everyone is really trying to work collectively to demonstrate the importance of trying and learning from new and creative approaches to thinking about, and then also practicing reconciliation. And really what I think is also unique and that I love about this book, which I've read so many times as an editor, is the reflections that our authors have shared on what they learned from their attempts that were both successful and less successful in their process of journeying towards reconciliation. So today we're joined, and we're so pleased to be joined by 4 of our amazing authors that contributed chapters to Pathways of Reconciliation. And I'll introduce each of them in turn, and they'll share just for a few minutes a reflection on their contribution to the book. So our first author up is David McDonald, who's a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Guelph. I believe he's joining us from Guelph. Welcome, David. And he's of mixed race descent, political science professor who's originally from Treaty 4 lands in Regina and has Trinidadian and Scottish ancestry. So coming at this from a very unique and grounded perspective in identity. And we look forward to you sharing a little bit about your thoughts on reconciliation. Over to you, David. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. And greetings from Guelph, which is on the ancestral lands of the Attawandaron people and the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. As Aimée mentioned, my mom is from Trinidad. They're Indo-Trinidadians. My dad's originally from Scotland. We found out recently, too, that our ancestors were indentured laborers from Uttar Pradesh and the Bihar areas of India, and they were attached to 3 sugar estates in the south of Trinidad, Esperance Exchange and the Jordan Hill Sugar Estate. So part of this chapter is kind of framed through my own positionality, my mother's family coming to Canada during the 1960s, this era of multiculturalism, undergoing their own forms of racism in Regina as they were living, but then also encountering forms of anti-Indigenous racism, settler colonialism, the continuation of residential schools, forms of cultural genocide, everything kind of working at the same time in different ways. So my own family is kind of striving for recognition, respect, equality, and belonging here in Canada has informed my work. And I suppose the chapter, in a very brief way, is kind of a warning to settler Canadians, which is to not conflate equality and US-style civil rights with Indigenous rights, and not to assume that filling economic and social gaps is what reconciliation is necessarily all about. Also, for those of you who are racialized people, just if you can make it economically in Canada doesn't mean that everybody will necessarily or should be emulating that example. And multiculturalism is not necessarily the success story that the government, for example, would like it to be. And I'm also very clear in the chapter that the lessons of multiculturalism, both positive and negative, should not be informing how we approach reconciliation. So the chapter briefly is divided into 4 sections, and I think Aimée said talk for 3 to 5 minutes, so I'm watching the clock pretty carefully here. I begin by outlining the differences between what I see as liberal and transformative reconciliation. The liberal approach is where everyone is seen to be kind of equal citizens, for example. So reconciliation then becomes primarily about bringing everybody to the same level, but according to a settler framework. The more liberal or the more transformative form of reconciliation that I would advocate in the chapter is looking at respecting Indigenous sui generis rights to self-determination and all of the welcome changes that will bring. And I note that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's view of reconciliation closely weaves liberal and transformative forms of reconciliation together. A second lengthy section, which I'm not going to get into here, is a critical reading of a recent Environics survey on settler perceptions of Indigenous peoples, which backs up the concern I just expressed, which is that most settler respondents understand reconciliation primarily in terms of liberal equality, providing economic and other forms of equality to Indigenous peoples, but within the institutional structures and ideological boundaries of the settler state. And there's a civil rights dimension to this too, because there's sort of this idea that just as the civil rights era brought equality supposedly to African Americans, or at least helped launch a certain process, that's partly what reconciliation should be about. So the idea of reconciliation as closing gaps becomes really important, growing the middle class, but reinforces this idea that there's something essentially assimilatory about the reconciliation process. The idea is sort of, to be comfortable like us, you should become like us. And that's a perception that at least comes through with some of the Environics surveys. I would say it's a misperception amongst many settler respondents about what the reconciliation process is all about. And it's kind of designed, I suppose, in a sense, in the minds of settlers, to make reconciliation comfortable and to sort of reverse what Paulette Regan says, to try to settle the settler within. And that becomes a bit of a goal, I think, for some people who are approaching reconciliation without wanting to actually do too much about it. Transformative reconciliation, I argue, is going to be more difficult, but it's also going to produce much greater results, because we do need to understand the settler state as a colonial creation, a vector of cultural genocide, and one that continues to suppress Indigenous collective aspirations for self-determination and sovereignty. So we will inevitably see and need to see, I think, the rollback of the settler state. And some good work has been done recently looking at the links between resurgence and reconciliation. So I would add to that the third R, which I think is the rollback of the settler state, to help provide more space for the resurgence in the process of reconciliation to begin. There's a lot of stuff about critiquing multiculturalism here as well. But I think in the interest of time, I'll just leave it. And if anyone is interested in looking at how I critically engage with multiculturalism and also issues of things like anti-Black racism in Canada, I'm happy to chat about that during the discussion time. So again, thank you so much to Aimée and Paulette and everybody and Ariel for inviting me here to participate in this event. And I'll look forward to some of the questions afterwards. Was that about the right time, or you want me to talk more?
Perfect. That's
okay,
perfect,
all right.
David. Thank you. We really appreciate that. And I'll encourage those who are joining us to put any questions that you have for David right into the Q&A. The function is at the bottom of the screen. And I'll be able to share those with our speakers, and we'll have an opportunity for a question and answer period and discussion at the end of the presentation of the chapters. So please feel free to start putting in your questions. Our next speaker is Régine King, who's joining us from Calgary. She's an associate professor in the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Calgary. And Régine's interests are focused on psychosocial processes involving survivors of organized and structural violence. And this includes approaches to cross-cultural mental health, forgiveness, reconciliation amongst survivors of organized violence. And her work is rooted in her extensive practice in community-based mental health organizations in both Canada and Rwanda. Thank you for joining us, Régine, and for sharing some of your lessons from the Gacaca process in Rwanda.
Thank you very much, Aimée and Paulette, and for your tenacity and persistence in having this book finally published. It has been since 2016 when we had the first conference in Winnipeg, where I lived for 5 years. So the idea of having a conference on the pathway to reconciliation, I felt like as a new settler to Canada myself, originally from Rwanda, I needed to reflect more on what reconciliation looks like for me as someone who witnessed the genocide, the 94 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, but also lived in Canada at the time when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission it was born and being implemented, but also being challenged by the calls to action as a new Canadian. So my friend Benjamin Maiwanga, who was a PhD student in Manitoba at the time in peace and conflict studies, actually worked with me to put literature together, but also to really pay attention to the critique of the controversial literature that talked about Gacaca. So many of you may be wondering what Gacaca is. Gacaca is a form of TRC in a post-genocide Rwanda. In '94, for those who don't know, about 1 million of Rwandans were killed by their own neighbors and former friends. So after the genocide, it became very difficult to know how Rwandans who still, those who survived and those whose families committed the genocide didn't know how to go back to living together in the same communities. So somewhere around in 2000, they started conceptualizing ways of doing a TRC that will be appropriate for Rwanda. So in 2002, the model was being tested, and I'm saying being tested because we didn't have lawyers. People had to rely on community judges of people they called people with integrity, chosen from different communities in Rwanda. And these were people who were going to facilitate the process of hearing testimonies, but also making decisions on who was going to be pardoned and be reintegrated back into the community, but also who were the people who committed the genocide, who were going to be given a retributive charge at the end of the process. So in Rwanda, it was a kind of a different process. It was almost like one day, one Saturday in a month, where the whole country shut down, and the people in different villages sat around the community judges, and testimonies were shared. So I feel like there's something happened in Rwanda, and of course, many different scholars, based on their personal judgment or disciplinary approaches, they have taken a very controversial take to Gacaca, but also to TRC in Rwanda. I'm not going to go into details of what that entails. I will encourage those who are interested to read more about Gacaca. But what was very fascinating to me as a Rwandan Canadian was to actually visit Rwanda at the time when the Gacaca was taking place, but also being present when the TRC and the public testimonies were being provided. So in this chapter, we provide a nuanced approach of critiquing the existing literature for those who are for and those who are against. And then we draw a conclusion on three main lessons that I feel like as a Rwandan Canadian, but also for other Canadians who may be questioning how they fit into the TRC, can maybe critically reflect on. Those three lessons are based on the literature that we covered, but also some of the personal experiences that I share through the chapter, that all the TRC, they really need to be context-based. We can't take the context of Rwanda and replicate it in Canada, the same way we can't take what's happening in Canada to any other setting. So TRCs are contextualized, but also when we are talking about the implementation of TRCs, but also for Canada calls to action, we need to be mindful that these are very roaded processes, and as we approach them, we need to be very mindful of the setting, of the issues at the hand, their histories, but also remain flexible and open to what can transpire from processes of which we are not very familiar with. But also really remain vigilant and careful as we examine how these processes are really responding to what was defined as calls to action. TRC, I would say that they take us beyond the Western models of legal justice and their ways of knowing. They take us beyond what we have known in other settings as conflict resolutions and justice models. They become work of their own, and they can really inform us on different theories, but also on how to move forward together. Because at the end of the day, at this time of COVID, we have all been reminded of how interdependent we are locally and globally. And through the process, I have learned that actually no society is ever perfect. And in every process, in every approach of TRC, we should be really questioning more of the bigger issues of the impacts of mass violence, of colonialism, of different forms of oppressions and dehumanization, and really choose ways for peace and peaceful coexistence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Régine. I love the reflections of each of our authors, because you're really bringing at the same time amazing intellectual knowledge to the discussion, but also your personal experience and views, which I think makes, like I said earlier, this volume quite rich. Our next speaker is Andrea Walsh, who's an associate professor and more recently the Smith Chair in Arts and Engagement at the University of Victoria. Andrea is a visual anthropologist who specializes in 20th century and contemporary Indigenous art and visual culture in Canada, as well as theoretical and methodological approaches to visual research. Her chapter is called Repatriation, Reconciliation, and Refiguring Relationships. It's a case study of the return of children's artwork from the Alberni Indian Residential School to survivors and their families. Thank you, Andrea, for sharing a bit of this story with us tonight.
Thank you. I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you tonight from my home that is in the territories of the Wasinich First Nation here in Salish territories in British Columbia. And the work that I want to share with you that is written up in the chapter is actually the work of many people. And so I just have the pleasure of writing about it in the book, but there's probably a host of up to 60 people who are behind this work, and they include faculty, survivors, their families, students, community. So this is a very multifaceted story. And I want to also just say that the beautiful cover that's on this book is one of the paintings done by one of the survivors as a child with whom we're working, and that's Gina Lang. And so it's her painting of her home at Kildonan in the Uchuckwissut First Nation. So as Aimée said, one of the things that I think was nice about writing this chapter was that it was an opportunity to recount the return of children's paintings to survivors of the Alberni Indian Residential School. And because I'm an artist and a curator, I actually brought some slides with me. And they have, these are pictures that are in the chapter as well. So if you see this, you will see a little bit of what's in the chapter. But I wanted to share with you what these paintings looked like before I started talking about them. There's 75 of them. They were done in the late 1950s, and they were done in an extracurricular art class at the residential school. And the paintings that you see on the screen here are just 4 of those which we have returned. And so the people that are named on the screen have given me permission to share these paintings. But to give you an idea of what they look like and what our project was about is returning these paintings that were very important to children at the time they were in the school. And so the teacher, Mr. Robert Aller, he was very supportive of the kids in the school, maintaining their knowledge, maintaining their language. And so his archive, which came to the University of Victoria along with these paintings after his death in 2008, indicates that he had a very different opinion of education for Indigenous people. And so in his classes, he really encouraged kids to think about land, territory, people, events. And you see these subjects coming up in the paintings that he helped the kids create in his class. He himself was a professional artist. So the chapter that I wrote details the story of the return of these paintings between around 2012 to 2017. And the main portion of the chapter deals with how we worked between the University of Victoria and survivors of the Alberni School, their families, community, to put on a repatriation feast of these paintings from the university back to survivors in 2013. And what was so special about this event and the work that we do and we continue to do even now through the pandemic together is that we call this survivor-led. And what I mean by that and what we describe in the chapter is that survivors really were at the helm in terms of deciding how the university would return the paintings, how we would go about contacting other survivors, and how the repatriation, the return of the paintings would occur. And so that feast, before it could happen, we actually did a lot of community work, and the chapter describes how we went about going from community to community with these paintings basically in the back of my car, and bringing the archive that Mr. Aller had of photographs as well as the paintings, his letters, to different communities. And because children had their paintings or their names on the bottom of the paintings, we were able to identify the makers of the paintings, and survivors would remember, oh, that's so-and-so's sister, oh, that's a cousin, oh, he's gone back home to Bella Bella. And so these post-school survivor networks were really important for the university to respect, in terms of that would be the way through which we would get a hold of people. And we followed the protocol of the nations in whose territories we were working as we contacted everybody. So the group that formed, when I say there's about 60 people that are behind the words in this chapter, there is a core group of people who are kind of 12 to 20 in number. And over the 5 years that get discussed in the chapters, this group has accomplished amazing things. And dozens of art exhibitions have been created, educational programming, cultural events, community events. But one of the things that I think that all of the survivors that are part of this work would say is a highlight is working with the Canadian Museum of History, when we worked with Jamie Trepanier and his team to bring this story of the return of the paintings to the newly renovated Canada Hall as part of the story of post-Confederation and reconciliation in Canada. And so the chapter details these sorts of events. It's, as I say, it's not a theoretical perspective, it's more a record. It was an opportunity for us to say, this is how we did this work and this is who was involved. But as much as the chapter allowed us to stop and take account of this work, it also allowed us to reflect on the work to date and what it's meant for broader connections to reconciliation work in Canada. And specifically the way that our grassroots kind of activist work was intersecting with the larger work that is being done in provincial museums, national museums, even district museums, as well as educational institutions like the University of Victoria. And so key points and questions that I pose at the close of the chapter include rethinking ethnographic collections in the context of children's culture and museums, the role that art has played in the official record of the TRC, and the creation of archives after the TRC moves through, and how the work that we did around repatriating artwork to residential school survivors is fundamentally different than a lot of the repatriation work that's happened in Canada, where institutions are working with nations. So we also reflected a lot on how the process of everything that happened was, as I say, survivor-led. And one of the challenges that I talk about at the end of the chapter is how, and I think this kind of echoes with what David was talking about, and that is, how does this work not become appropriated by the institutions that we're displaying this art in at the with the permission of survivors and with their ongoing consent. And so this is just a photo taken at the end of the feast with people with their paintings back. Some of the people, some of the paintings. So maybe I'll stop my little spiel there.
Thank you, Andrea. I love seeing the art and the people, and I really appreciate how you documented the whole process through photos. And I know this is just a glimpse into your archive of the people, the photos of the people and the art that were engaged in this really important work. So thank you for sharing some of that. Our next speaker is Cheryl Lightfoot, who's currently Senior Advisor to the President at the University of British Columbia on Indigenous Affairs. She's a Canada Research Chair in Global Indigenous Rights and Politics, an Associate Professor in the First Nations and Indigenous Studies and Political Science Department at the University of British Columbia. And her chapter is the concluding chapter in the book and provides some reflections on the pathways, but also the broader context of reconciliation in an international reconciliation environment, which is her area of expertise, and really brings different pieces of this type of work into conversation with each other in her closing chapter. So thanks for joining us, Cheryl, and for agreeing to share some of your insights.
Thanks, Aimée, and it's great to be with everyone this evening, even in our virtual format. I just want to thank everyone for keeping going and doing what we're doing in a safe and healthy way. I'm pleased to join you this evening from my home on the UBC campus in Vancouver, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I'm always grateful to be friends with the Musqueam people. They have really shown so much support for our students and programs here at UBC, and so I always want to acknowledge the important role that they play in that relationship. And as Aimée mentioned, it was my honor and privilege to write the conclusion for this volume. And so in order to do that, I actually had the opportunity for the first pre-read after Aimée and Paulette were finished with their work. So I received all of the chapters in their preliminary form, had the chance to read them all, spend some time reflecting, and then offer some thoughts that try to weave them all together and offer an overall reflection. So I'm pleased to share tonight a few of those key points, I think, that I drew out in the concluding chapter. And as I sat with all these chapters and really spent time with them, the one phrase that kept coming into my mind was a phrase from the TRC summary report. And it's so simple and so straightforward, but I think it really captured the essence of this book and the pathway that it is setting for us. And it's simply straight from the TRC report: reconciliation is going to take hard work. And that's how I began the conclusion, and I think it's a very powerful place to end our contributor talks tonight. And I want to draw out 3 key points from my experience reading the TRC reports, reflecting on their actionability and how that intersects with this volume and pathways forward. So first point is, I really think prior to the TRC's final report, there has been a huge debate and many conversations and a multitude of definitions on what reconciliation actually means. And it has been a contested concept in many academic circles and political circles and societal circles. And honestly, the TRC, for all intents and purposes, ended that debate, because it defined for us quite clearly what the term reconciliation should mean, must mean, and that it means deep systemic change, which requires many changes in beliefs and behavior through all sectors of society. And prior to that, as I mentioned, there were many voices of critique, and some of those voices have continued, that were saying and still believe that reconciliation is code, or it's a problematic meaning some sort of intended assimilative politics, as David mentioned, or that there was some sort of conciliatory state that we're supposed to return to that never actually existed in all of Canada. In all of Canadian history, the TRC dealt with these issues straight up and acknowledged that in no way should reconciliation be interpreted as any of these things. It's not maintenance of the status quo. It is not legitimation of colonial structures and institutions. Rather, it means a long-term, ongoing, difficult process that comes to terms with that difficult past and tries to make a healthy and respectful relationship going forward. And I think all of the authors in this volume very soberly recognize the work and the deep work and the challenges and how long and difficult this is going to be, and especially the breadth and the depth of the work yet to be done. Secondly, my second point is the TRC's another huge contribution for all of us is that they clearly linked reconciliation to the need to eradicate all doctrines of supremacy. So this means all doctrines of European white supremacy, discourses of colonialism. They took those head on and said each and every one of them is illegitimate and there's no place for that in our society. And there were, of course, this is not the first time this has been written about in Indigenous circles, and it certainly won't be the last. But what I appreciate about the TRC is that they were cognizant of it and they included it in this document for us and made that part of our pathway forward. And then the third point that I want to make about how important the work of the TRC was is that it embedded the UN Declaration into its work and into the concept of reconciliation, and therefore provided us a roadmap for the changes of behavior that we need, a roadmap for the systems change that we need. And they turned to the Declaration, which is already a standard-setting tool that had been worked on for decades between Indigenous advocates and the United Nations and the member states of the United Nations. And over several decades, they banged out together 46 articles that go into intricate detail on what better relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in a society must look like. Not should look like, but must look like. And so the TRC was, I think, quite bold in that work that it laid out for us, but also very clear. So there's really no misunderstandings and no mistakes. And I so appreciate those efforts forward. And just to sum up, I just want to end, and I ended the chapter with this, and I quoted the TRC's final summary report, because I think it was a good place to end, and that's where I'd like to end our official comments tonight. And the TRC report cited and said, directed us, the way we govern ourselves must change. Laws must change. Policies and programs must change. The way we educate our children and ourselves must change. The way we do business must change. Thinking must change. The way we talk to and about each other must change. And all Canadians must make a firm and lasting commitment to reconciliation to ensure that Canada is a country where our children and grandchildren can thrive. Reconciliation is not a destination, but rather a difficult and necessary journey we must all make together and far into the future. So with that, I'm going to go back to you, Aimée.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. And I think that closing comment and the quote from the TRC really tells us that there is something for everyone in answer to that question, what can I do to give effect to reconciliation, right? This is a societal project. It requires major systems changes, but there is a role for every single individual in that work. So thank you to each of our contributors for sharing their thoughts and their chapters. I'm just so happy to hear about this work, and I really, as I said earlier, appreciate the depth and diversity of the contributions. We did want to have an opportunity for each of our panelists to have a conversation with each other, and I'm going to turn it over to Paulette. I asked her, I think yesterday, to come up with a really brilliant question on reconciliation, which is not fair of me whatsoever, but knowing Paulette Regan, she was able to come up with a brilliant question on reconciliation. and there she is, to get our authors to engage and reflect on each other's works, and how some of this has evolved in a post-TRC world. So over to you, Paulette.
Thanks, Aimée. I want to echo what Aimée just said about these amazing presentations. They're thoughtful and thought-provoking, and I've enjoyed listening so much. So the TRC's vision of reconciliation was an unsettling call to decolonizing transformative consciousness and action directed at Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples across Canadian society. And I think that, you know, various people have touched on this already. The Commission's calls to action established a framework to guide post-TRC processes and outcomes designed to remedy the ongoing relational and structural injustices of settler colonialism. So addressing both the relational and the structural injustices is essential, because you can't change structures without changing people. So settler colonial structures are rooted in both interpersonal and institutional relationships built on the everyday actions of people at all levels of society, which is why, again, why this book is so incredibly rich, because it deals with all of it deals with both of these kinds of injustices in various ways, but very much from a practice-based perspective. So my question to you is, and I invite you to have a conversation around this, how does your own work and that of the other panelists make these critical connections between relational and structural injustices in ways that contribute to theories, ethics, and practices of reconciliation in post-TRC Canada and elsewhere in the world? So I look forward to hearing your various responses to that question and to each other.
I'll go ahead and get us started. Then we can hopefully just riff off one another and see where we end up. I'm just going to take one element of that, Paulette, and thank you for the question. I think you did your job. So I want to congratulate you for coming up with that brilliant question, and thanks to Aimée for giving you the job. From my perspective, and I'll just take one little bit of that and then try to leave plenty of space for others to weigh in from where they sit. But of course, my work is focused around Indigenous rights and politics, and primarily the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and other international human rights law. So what I appreciate about the TRC and how it defined reconciliation moving forward is that they internationalized the issue and moved it beyond just a social conversation or a historical conversation or even a domestic political and legal conversation. They situated it clearly within international vision. And I think that did a couple things. So first of all, it brought an international lens to Canadian history that was much more honest than what Canada had been feeding the world up until that point. Canada, of course, situates itself as a very human rights supporting country, a peacemaking country. And in many ways and aspects, we know that that is true, but it's not the whole truth. And that there is this very real stain on Canadian history and reputation concerning Indigenous policy and practices going back a very long time that is now in full international view. There's no longer a place to hide. And I think that has brought about a reckoning of sorts, because the Canada now needs to answer to the international community about its weaknesses in Indigenous rights. And it must do so now. Now countries like China and Iran come to the UN and ask tough questions about Indigenous policy and Indigenous affairs in Canada. And that's an uncomfortable and unusual moment for Canada, but now they have to answer those questions, and they are under some kind of scrutiny that really wasn't the case before. And then also, again, and this touches on some of the points that I mentioned before, but by situating the forward pathway in the UN Declaration, that was an incredibly strong position, because I think, Paulette, it addresses behaviors, beliefs, and systems all at the same time, and in no particular order. So they didn't, when you look at the declaration and the TRC, they didn't necessarily say, oh, beliefs have to come first, then behaviors, and then we change systems. No, they wanted it all changed simultaneously. Pick a piece and run with it is the message that I get coming out of the TRC. So I appreciate all of that. And my closing thought on that is also, by internationalizing the issue, they did a very clever strategic move, I think, and that was by tying reconciliation and human rights to the declaration and implementation of the declaration, they created a moral bind. So now if someone wanted to be anti-UN declaration, it also means they're anti-TRC. And that creates a very difficult moral position for one to take. And it has had impacts on Canadian politics and politics in other countries in ways that we are only just beginning to see now.
Oh, thank you, Cheryl. That we're off to a great start in our discussion, because I think you captured beautifully what I was getting at in terms of, bringing these things together. It's not either or, it's both. So thanks.
I guess I could add to that a little bit. Just on the internationalization front, I think that was something that the TRC reports did really well. So in terms of, and also with the honorary witnesses and things like that, bringing in people from different backgrounds in Canada to take part in all of this. I mean, I've seen sort of a reconciliation process unfold in New Zealand, as Sheryl and other people have, but there's a sense in that context that it's really about sort of white people and Indigenous people. And sometimes relationships are framed in a certain way that some groups of people don't, maybe they don't feel a sense of responsibility, or they might be interested, but they don't necessarily know how it relates to them. And I think one of the strengths of the TRC process, not just the reports, and we also talk about it in the book a little bit, is that sense that newcomers to Canada, people of different ethnic backgrounds, like my mom's family and stuff, all have a stake and a responsibility in the process of reconciliation. And I think it's important, like this, the TRC was very good at sort of unpacking these concepts of, like, it's not really about guilt or shame, but it is about responsibility. And I remember Senator Sinclair saying something about, well, maybe you didn't know in the past, but you know now. And so now that you know, you have a responsibility to do something. And I think that's a message for, all Canadians, whether, just arrived in Canada or they've been here for a very long time. And I think it's, so I think the sense of responsibility is really important. In my own work too, I kind of try to tease out what that might mean for different groups of people. So I guess, yeah, maybe I'm interested in engaging some of the racialized communities in different places. I mean, I do other stuff as well, but that's, in the context of this book, that's something that I was quite interested in exploring further.
Thanks, David. I think there again, you touched on, the process, the TRC process itself, which I think is incredibly important, because post-TRC, that continues to be the case too. It continues to be about process and about outcome. And so I'm mindful. I'm mindful, for example, of Andrea's point that the work that she's doing continues. It's still ongoing. So it's that sort of sense that was a beginning, and that these processes carry on. And in terms of the international, you mentioned the honorary witnesses. So that was, I think, a very deliberate attempt, as you say, to bring people in from outside of Canada as well to be witness to the process. So thanks.
I would add, for me, in answering your question, is really understanding different levels of intervention. That yes, the systems, we need Canada to name and acknowledge what happened. That's the level of intervention. And I guess connecting that to what happened in post-genocide in Rwanda, people had expectations of what reconciliation looked like. If they believed that was something only that was going to happen at the grassroots level. And then they felt so disappointed that the government actually came in to do a particular things. But that's not sufficient if it's only done by the government level and nothing is done by in the social settings where people are supposed to be living and carrying out actually the work of reconciliation. I like your idea, Paulette, that TRC is just a beginning. And then the work has to continue in all directions and by everyone involved. And for the context of Canada, adding to what David said, the tendency to think that if I wasn't here, it's not my job. I think we had stories like that, especially among newcomers. Some of them without knowing, feeling that yes, we are also survivors of colonialism from other places and violence, and who is helping us to acknowledge that. And I think that's what it takes it really to the global and international level. That whether you find yourself here in Canada, there is a responsibility that goes with the place where you believe, where you raise your children, where you work, but also it gives reasons to think of what happens internationally and how it influences us, but also how Canada influences what happens elsewhere.
Yes, thanks very much, Régine. And I think also, you touched on this at the beginning, the importance of local community-grounded perspectives, which is really so critical too, because it's not just top-down processes that need to happen. I think there's so much on the ground work that needs to happen, and that's, I think, really where the real work gets done. I mean, there are these overarching frameworks, and they serve a purpose, but it's actually in the everyday relationships of people on the ground that will make the difference long term, because that's what will sustain this over time, I think, as well. So the idea of the reciprocity of this transnational learning and building on that kind of work on the international level, I think is so important, because there are various lessons to be learned from all of these processes, and that's, I think, the richness of the international, the transnational perspective. So thanks very much.
Paulette, I was thinking about what you were just saying there about the community and on the ground work. And I'm in awe of my colleagues who are very, just so articulate in terms of the way in which you take up these bigger processes. And I think it's interesting to think about the kind of work that we've done in this project and how just so deeply local it is, and how it ended up over the 5 years kind of, and I don't know whether the right word is coming up to a higher level, like to be seen at the National Museum as an example of what an act of reconciliation looks like. But I'm thinking about also the quote that Cheryl was sharing at the end about how much change has to take place. And one of the things that I think a lot about in terms of relational structural change is always who's at the table and what's the language we're using. And even things in my work, some survivors say, can we just stop saying this big word you're using, repatriation? Can we just say return? And we get caught up in the way in which we speak in institutions. And I think part of the privilege I've had of learning with survivors is that there's a whole other kind of knowledge and scholarship that is there to be, and it's not, the word is not explored, but is there to be shared and nurtured, that doesn't come from within the institutions. Like when you look at the people who are involved in our project and the knowledge that they brought to those paintings. There's also, I was going to say around structural change, is that what I've witnessed in both the university level, but also at the level of the National Museum, is individuals within those institutions who have taken risks in their jobs to say, you know what, this isn't what we would normally do, but it feels right. Like this is the right thing. And so when the university was given the paintings in 2008, was the largest extant collection of children's Indigenous art in Canada from that era. There was over 700 of these paintings. And you would have normally thought, well, the university would say, well, this is great. We'll look after these paintings really well. We'll invite people to come see them, and we'll do the best we can with these. And instead, Mary Jo Hughes, who's the director of the gallery, said, you know what, this is, the TRC is on. See if you can find these people. Like, and she said, we'll let it go. And in letting that archive go, the amount of knowledge around those paintings has just been exponential explosion. Like you've witnessed it yourself, Paulette. You've been at the ceremonies and you've seen how much we know. And if the university had kept on with its regular policies around collection, would have been the story of a benevolent white man who did some, had some good ideas. And I would say even at the level of the National Museum, working with Jamie Trepanier there, he held the museum open, I don't know how many extra hours one night. And I'm sure there was extra security costs and all sorts of stuff because the survivors hadn't finished speaking. And protocol has us that everybody speaks until the words are finished. And we all get a chance to be heard. And so breaking those things of, well, the public engagement is supposed to go from 7 to 8:30. And it was very uncomfortable for him. And I think he set a precedent for, institutions have to change. We can't just slot these into these time frames. So those relationships that we've developed over the last 8 years, I think, support individuals within those institutions to take those risks. And we support them from outside and inward. So for me, it's like really an interesting question to reflect on the scales of which we can answer that question in closeness.
Oh, thanks so much, Andrea. And I have so many powerful memories of that process and just the way in which survivors, as you say, took the leadership role in putting that project, putting the process forward and shaping what that was going to look like. And the idea around how people in institutions can take leadership by taking risks to do something differently because it felt right. Was it the usual normal thing to do? No, not in the slightest. And I think the other thing that you really sort of brought to my mind was the incredibly difficult work this is at times as well. because I know it's not an easy process. I can't remember now who said, I think might have been Justice Sinclair or one of the other commissioners who said, you know, reconciliation isn't for the faint of heart, because it takes that kind of willingness to be in those uncomfortable places. And having said that, it was such an incredibly powerful and rich process that, as you say, continues today. So it's that beautiful intersection between the relationships and the structures, and as you say, how does that play out at different levels, which I think is there's a lot in that to explore. So thanks so much, Andrea. So, and I'm thinking that that's probably our time, Aimée. So perhaps I will, does somebody else have anything else that they want to add, or shall I turn it back to Aimée now?
I think that we can keep weaving some of this conversation into the Q&A, and we have a couple of questions that have come up from some of our participants. And I just want to pick up on that idea of relationships and structures. And so I'm a lawyer, and I think in terms of law and ethics. And I think kind of what you're getting at, Andrea, with, you know, this idea of dismantling institutional rigidity is actually about displacing it in favor of Indigenous ethics. And the example that you gave, you know, following protocol of everyone speaking, is actually not just taking risks or doing something because it feels like it's the right thing. It's actually a whole other system of complex governance that has been, you know, systemically cast aside through colonial structures and institutions, that is now being given space to breathe and give itself effect again. And I think that that's really powerful in itself, and, you know, in thinking of it that way as a reclamation of Indigenous ethics, which in large part, you know, Sheryl, David, others will probably agree that, you know, by the TRC recognizing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, is also kind of working at reclaiming Indigenous ethics through the concepts that are in the declaration itself. So I think that is also a powerful statement through the TRC's adoption of UN DRIP. So what a rich conversation that's going on. There's a question from Winona Wheeler, and she's thanking you for, you know, so important to share these stories of reconciliation in action, and asking, what can others learn from your experiences? And I'll leave this open to any of the panelists who would like to share about what they think, how their stories can then relate to others in terms of their learning. And Andrea, do you want to lead us off? Because I think that there's actually a lot for others to learn from the rich experience that you had with the children's artwork and the Return project.
Yeah. I don't know. I think always of, you know, Paulette's thing about learning to be uncomfortable. That's an obvious thing. I think when I speak in public about reconciliation and this work, one of the things, like there's conversations that we have with our colleagues and in institutions, like what can we learn? And we're usually talking about like our practice and our jobs and our careers and what we do. But I think there's also a really important question that we have as academics and practitioners with the public. And a lot of time, I just say, you know, where did you grow up? Where did, you know, do you know what school, like in the case of what we were doing, what is the residential school that was in the territory that you grew up, or the day school? And if there wasn't one, you know, how far did kids have to go? Where was the closest one? and getting them to see themselves as part of the picture. And I always, I begun to share the story that when I started this project, I positioned myself as an academic and I was doing this work, but through my own research and asking myself those questions, like not where I am theoretically or ethically in my job, but who I am as with the name my parents gave me. Where do I sit in the picture of this big story? And when I started doing that, I discovered here I am, an anthropologist, curator, working with residential school art and residential school survivors. I didn't know my own great-grandmother and great-great-grandmother were at St. Anne's and St. Mary's Indian residential schools. And so it was about learning more about who I am and who am I as a Canadian coming to this story. And I think that for me, if I would share what is the biggest experience I've had, it's coming to know who I am as a Canadian in this bigger picture. And that can just happen with some personal thinking about who you are and what you're doing in your own job, and do those feelings align with what you're doing in your job. And I think that that's when I talk to staff at the university, they say, I feel one way, but my job description's another way. And that's the real tough question that Justice Sinclair is asking us to make, is have those conversations about, if this doesn't feel right, let's start talking about it. It's as simple as that. So I kind of tend to think that the experience that I would share is start with yourself. Always like, what is your relationship to the story? And whether it's like what Régine was sharing or David, that they're bringing in these international kind of contexts, it's still applicable.
I was going to add the very simple answer that we all live in families and communities, and we work in institutions, belong to institutions. So I think for each one of us is really to ask ourselves that question, who am I? And how do I reflect the institutions when I'm working with them or when they are working with me? But also, how do I belong to families that acknowledge our next door neighbors, or the ones who have never been acknowledged and maybe who were here before us, who are the owners of the land on which we stand. I think once we start asking those questions, then we become curious to learn, but also to challenge some of the stereotypes that people have internalized and sometimes don't even know. And this goes to the relationships with Indigenous people and other racialized groups. I always find it very tempting when I challenge students, now as we are all online, to just simply ask them, so what territory do they reside on, and what do they know about it? It's so amazing to see how that can be a shocking question to think of. So where do I live, and how did I end up here? And how do I acknowledge the place in which I live?
David or Cheryl, did you want to jump in, or should I move to the next question?
Well, you go ahead, Cheryl. I'll say something after you.
Okay, thanks, David. Yeah, just a couple thoughts to add. And I guess I'll draw from my current role as Senior Advisor on Indigenous Affairs at UBC, because we just launched our Indigenous Strategic Plan a couple months ago, and I get asked now almost daily, where do we start? What do we do to begin? What's our first step? And of course, most people are looking for me in my role to give them a checklist or some marching orders, and it just is not that simple. So I turn it around on everyone and say, well, actually, what I'd like you to do to get started is, if you haven't done it yet, and I'm actually amazed how many people have not taken this step, read the 94 calls to action and read the 46 articles of the UN Declaration. And as you're reading those, find yourself in them. And whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, find 2 or 3 that you can action right away, that you can change in your daily life, or that you can advocate for in your daily life. And I guarantee you, everyone will find at least 2 or 3 or 4 between those 2 documents that can become short-term, medium, and longer-term goals in your regular work life, civic life, family life, guaranteed.
That's great. I was going to say something totally different, which is just that as I've been exploring a lot of the work of the TRC, but just getting more and more, doing more research and things on settler colonialism, the British Empire was and is a transnational perpetrator. It's an international perpetrator that set up networks and structures of violence throughout the world. And I think that's one of the interesting things that maybe connects probably all of us, with, you know, whether newcomers or indigenous peoples or older settlers, is the fact that there has been this very long-term process of colonization around the world. So it's not just a Canadian problem or an American problem or a New Zealand problem, but it's something that I think resonates with people everywhere. And I think it's this myth of Canada as this wonderful haven for everybody really ignores the central role that Canada has played as part of an imperial system, where there was a tremendous fluidity of borders. And I mean, people were stationed in India, they were fighting in Africa, then they were in Saskatchewan. I mean, they were all over the place. And so it's, you know, I think part of the interesting part of looking at the history of settler colonialism as well, and that sort of stuff, and its current impact today, is how transnational the process was. And I think that brings in all sorts of people from around the world that are living here into that same process, because we've all kind of been touched with different aspects of an imperial system. So I don't know if that really relates to anything or not, but I just thought I'd sort of put it out as another thing to think about, maybe.
I was thinking about, you know, listening like to all of the panelists tonight, and that idea of that came through the TRC of witnessing, I think is still something that we should be learning how to do. And when I'm sitting in community or thinking about things with survivors, it's really impressed upon me that we're not finished telling truths. Like, we're not ready to move forward into, you know, thinking through this stuff, like in terms of fast forward to implementing change is, and it kind of goes back a little bit, like, I mean, not to make a direct link, but to what I was saying earlier, that everybody hasn't spoken yet. And one of the things that I'm thinking more about now is the role that intergenerational survivors and how we support their truth telling, and that the TRC really focused a lot on the history, but the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I think, should be also seen in the way that it's being pitched here as a future mechanism, and how we work through this in the future. And I'm mindful that in Canada, as this generation of survivors who gave their truth at the Truth and Reconciliation move on and pass away, and we recognize that those stories are held in the next generation, and that we have people to talk to, and that we must continue to witness. And it's not just the generation that was at the schools, that we need to practice how to learn to witness. So that would be something I would think about my experiences, thinking about what it means to be a witness.
Thanks for that, Andrea. And it's tied to the question that I wanted to ask about land. And so when you say we haven't heard from everyone yet, my mind actually went to land and water, and thinking about what we have to hear from our other than human relatives. And so I remember in the context of the TRC, that a group of elders had been assembled to discuss, what does reconciliation, what are words for reconciliation in your language, and what does reconciliation mean for you? And those were two really important questions. And I think the answers were, as you would expect from elders, there's no one word, and that we can't fully define the concept. It's very rooted in practice. And I remember some of the words from Mary Deliri stand out, and they still do today, that we have to reconcile with the land first. And I think that that in itself is a really powerful statement, because a lot of our thinking and action is really grounded in sort of this human-centric way of seeing change. And I wanted to ask, all of our panel members, what do you think can be transformative in terms of thinking about land relationships and other than human relationships as part of reconciliation? And maybe even tying that to some of the land movements, what's happening in Mi'kma'ki or Land Back Lane or Unistoten Camp, right? How these connections and relationships with land and Indigenous people are manifesting themselves in sort of different views of what might be part of this broader systemic change of reconciliation. So it's a very long-winded question, and feel free to answer it in the way that you would like. And Paulette, feel free to jump in as well with any sort of concluding remarks. I know we're getting a little bit shorter on time, so either feel free to answer the question or to share something that you feel is pressing given the wealth of information that's being exchanged here. Oh, this feels like teaching a class.
Yes, I can say
okay,
something.
Thank you, David.
Well, it's sort of, I guess it's consistent with my chapter, so I might as well say this, that I think the part of the problem that I looked at with this idea that reconciliation is like civil rights, it's like multiculturalism, is that it's still very resource extractive, and it's Warren Carey who calls it neoliberal reconciliation, which is just basically going in and we still carve up the pie and destroy the earth and the water and everything, but we just give a slice to Indigenous peoples and other people. And I think it's really important to stress that that wasn't a vision of reconciliation in the TRC report, as I understood it, and certainly it's not an understanding of recognition from any of the elders or survivors that I've talked to or worked with. And so I think it's really important to stress that. Just basically that point is that we need to rethink fundamentally, I think, issues of property, issues of resource extractive industry, and issues of what prosperity means, because there are tremendously awful things going on to our lands and our waters. And while we can talk about a long period of time before we achieve reconciliation, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of species of fish and animals and plants are going to be gone. And so this is something that certainly worries me a great deal, and probably many of you as well. So that was just all I was going to add to that.
I'll go ahead and jump in just with a quick thought. Again, with the tie between the TRC and the UN Declaration, there is a lot in the UN Declaration about traditional governance, traditional hereditary leadership, ties to land, resources. And even though a lot of it is written in UN language, so it is written in a very Western format, it's important to remember that the language that's there came out of decades of negotiation. So it was elders that went initially and said, we want our ways recognized in international law. And after several lawyers, of course, get a hold of it, no offense, Aimée, but lawyers put a particular Western framework in it so that it's legible to the systems. But make no mistake that there are strong community grounded elders and traditional people that were at those tables and put those concepts in there. So it's important to read the declaration through both lenses, how an elder would see it and then how a international lawyer would write it up.
I was just gonna say too that, like, thinking in terms of the curatorial work that I do, an interest in archives and museum collections, so much of I think what could be shared to answer Aimée's question is in the knowledge that's held in things that are like masks or regalia, or that we don't see as having agency. And I think that's kind of a really philosophical thing for some people to, they can't make that link that something that they see as inanimate is actually full of knowledge, and that we have to repair our relationships with those things, because they're much more than objects, and we can't do that from institutional perspective. That has to be where, again, you change who's at the table. And some people will say, well, actually, you can't know what that mask knows. That mask can't, like, we can't share that. But I do think that there are things that the way question resource that we don't even know about yet, that we've kept in cupboards, if that makes sense. I think that those collections that are part of that colonial history, they have just a wealth of knowledge that comes with them and is there has to be ended. It can't be.
Wow. I just want to, because I see we're up against the clock now, and I feel like our conversation is just getting going. So I'm feeling a little bit sad that that we're not going to be able to carry on. But I just want to, I so want to analysts and co-editor Aimée. And it's been such a thought-provoking panel, and I'm going to be reflecting on all of this, I think, for quite a long time. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Paulette. Thank you, Aimée.
Thank you, Paulette. Thank you, Aimée. It was great to see you all again.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, great to see you.
And thank you to everyone who joined us today. I know that there's a lot of thank yous popping up on my screen, and you know, it's wonderful to see how many people are going to be reading the book and purchasing the book, and hopefully we get to continue these conversations in a lot of different forums with even more folks than those who are here able to join us today. I know Ariel has some closing things from the University of Manitoba Press that she'd like to say. Once again, thank you so much, everyone. It was wonderful.
Thank you so much. That was really great. It was a really wonderful event to watch. I'm just answering a question that we've got in the chat about where to get the book. So I'm sharing the link there. All right, so our next event, this was a great event. We have another great event coming up on December 1st, which is our COVID-19 in Manitoba event, and that is about public policy responses to the pandemic. And that's a free ebook that can be downloaded from U of M Press's website. Tomorrow is the launch day, and then the launch is, it was the day that we release the ebook, and then the launch, which is another Zoom event like this one, is December 1st. Another thing to look at on our website is we have just launched these bundles of books. And so we've taken our most beloved books, we've bundled them in packages of 3, and we put 30% off. So please have a browse around, and we'll go from there. I'd like to bid everyone a very good night, to thank you for being a part of this event and on this time and place. And we will speak again soon. Thank you so much.